Good afternoon, teachers. Today's lesson, we're going to cover the determinants of aggregate demand. Before we get started, make sure that you have the kids remember how determinants worked in the microeconomic supply and demand model. They work effectively exactly the same way here, with the notable exception that we have two aggregate supply curves as opposed to one that they had on the microeconomics graph. So taking a look here, we're trying to figure out what are the things that cause shifts in the aggregate demand curve. Now, we're going to have a slight change of terminology here. Shifts are no longer shifts in the aggregate supply demand model, they are now shocks. And your shocks come in effectively two flavors. You have positive demand shocks and negative demand shocks. If demand increases, we call it a positive demand shock, which is a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve, so AD1 to AD2 here on our graph. And if we have a reduction in aggregate demand, that is a negative demand shock, represented by a leftward shift in our demand curve, represented by shift AD1 to AD3 over here. So this isn't super important, but the AP exam, especially on the multiple choice, is always going to refer to them as supply and demand shocks, and I don't want the kids getting confused. So try as best you can to use the term shocks in lieu of the term shifts. I know I call them shifts sometimes also, but I try to correct myself whenever possible, just so the kids don't get confused by the term shocks, as that's what they're going to see on the AP exam. So when tracking equilibrium on here, there's a really important concept the kids have to know, which is that the equilibrium point on the long run, short run aggregate supply aggregate demand model is always going to be at the intersection of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. So wherever aggregate demand intersects with short run, that's where our new equilibrium point is going to be. The long run aggregate supply curve is not useful for determining where equilibrium is. In fact, other than at E1 in our graph where we're in long-run equilibrium, we're pretty much not going to be on the long-run aggregate supply curve at any other time. The economy spends, 95% of its time or more in the short run. We live and we exist in the short run. Therefore, the equilibrium point is at the intersection of short run and aggregate demand, regardless of where the long-run aggregate supply curve happens to be. And another slight terminology difference, so at E1, because we happen to be on both the short run and the long run aggregate supply curves, that's what's known as long run equilibrium. If your equilibrium point is anywhere else other than at that point, it is known as short run equilibrium. Regardless of whether we are to the left or to the right of long run aggregate supply, we're going to be in short run equilibrium. So E3 and E2 both represent short run equilibrium. Now, going back to the determinants of aggregate demand, there's kind of a short version of this story and then a long version that involves actually going through the determinants. The short version of this is that aggregate demand is basically equal to consumer demand plus business demand plus government demand plus net exports demand. And so Sig-Jikson, those determinants of our GDP, those are all determinants of aggregate demand. And the good news is they all operate exactly the same way. So an increase in consumer spending or an increase in government spending or an increase in investment spending, they all have the same effect on aggregate demand. So if any of those components of GDP increases, aggregate demand is going to experience a positive shock, or if any of those determinants of GDP decrease, aggregate demand is going to experience a negative shock. So technically speaking, if the kids know that and they know what causes consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and export spending to change, that's pretty much all they need to know with regards to aggregate demand. The determinants are relatively easy. However, I want to go into a slightly longer story and talk about what are the main things that will cause each of those components of GDP to change, because those are the ones they're really going to see on the AP exam. So let's go over the long story. We have an acronym for this. The acronym is going to be PANG. I don't know if the kids remember that book about the duck, but from their childhood, but hopefully they do, because PANG is our acronym, and that was the name of the duck. So the P is by far the most complicated component of PANG. It represents the physical capital stock. And physical capital stock is basically telling us what is going to happen to investment spending this year by taking a look at what has happened to investment spending in previous years. The main thing to remember here is that when businesses invest, it's generally a one-time thing, right? So if I'm going to need to build a factory that builds Toyota Tundras, if I spent money to build that factory last year, then that's that much less investment I have to do this year. Whereas the opposite of that, if I've been pushing off investment for many, many years, that increases the likelihood that I'll have to invest this year. So investment in physical capital in previous years basically has an inverse relationship with investment spending this year on physical capital. So the way that we ask these questions is we'll phrase the question something like, if a nation has a high level of physical capital stock, what would we expect to happen to aggregate demand? And the answer in this case is we would expect aggregate demand to experience a negative shock. So if there's a lot of existing physical capital, we would expect investment spending from businesses to fall because if they've already invested in previous years, they don't need to continue that investment this year. Whereas if we have low levels of physical capital stock because they've been pushing off investment, we would expect investment spending this year to increase, causing a positive demand shock as businesses catch up with that investing they've been doing. And this is related to things like recessions. A lot of times when the economy is doing poorly, businesses will push off investment to the future, which is one of the reasons when the economy turns around, it tends to turn around relatively rapidly as not only do consumers start making purchases, but also businesses that are pushing off investment will all of a sudden actually do the investment that they should have done years ago. The E in paying is once again the ever trusty future expectations. And future expectations tells you what's happening to both consumer spending and to investment spending from businesses, as consumers and businesses both have future expectations and change their purchasing behaviors today based on what they foresee coming down the line. Long story short, the major way that we measure future expectations for the macroeconomics graph is through what's called the Consumer Confidence Index. This basically is a measurement for whether consumers are overall pessimistic or overall optimistic about the future. Consumers that are pessimistic about the future tend to save their money, and so we would expect aggregate demand to experience a negative shock as they stop spending and start saving as consumer spending falls. Consumers that are optimistic about the future are more likely to go out there and spend, especially on big purchases of durable goods. So consumers that are optimistic tend to have increases in their consumer spending, resulting in positive demand shocks. Another thing that I've seen the AP exam ask is, what do consumers or what do businesses do in response to expected future inflation? This is another way they like to ask effectively the same question. So if consumers expect prices on products to go up in the future, we would expect them to increase their spending today so that they can avoid those higher prices. And if consumers expect prices, heaven forbid, to experience deflation, if they expect prices to fall in the future, then they hold off spending today in the hopes of getting a better deal later on. That would, of course, be disastrous for the economy and result in significant negative demand shocks. The next one is the N in paying, which stands for net worth. Net worth is going to dictate what happens to consumer spending, and this is more of a feeling than anything else. So when consumers feel like they are more wealthy, they tend to spend more money, and we experience positive shocks. When consumers feel like they are less wealthy or they feel a little bit more poor, they tend to save rather than spend, and the economy experiences negative demand shocks. One of the things that you'll want to point out to the kids here is that there's a couple of big indicators that are going to tell us what's happening to people's net worth, which, by the way, is different from their yearly income. Most Americans hold their net worth, the vast majority of it, in two places, and so changes in either of these two places are going to affect their overall net worth. The first of those two places is going to be in the value of their home. So a significant portion of most Americans' net worth is tied up in real estate. So we would expect when the real estate market is doing good and their homes are very valuable, that they would increase their consumer spending and drive up aggregate demand. Whereas if we, had what happened in 2008, where the housing market crashed and the value of their home fell, we would expect to see negative demand shocks as consumers stopped purchasing as much and started saving due to the fact they felt less wealthy. The other place most Americans have their net worth is in the value of their retirement accounts, and by and large, those retirement accounts are in the stock market. So fluctuations in the stock market will also affect consumers' net worth and cause them to either spend more or spend less. When the stock market is doing really well, we tend to see consumer spending go up as people feel like they can treat themselves. And as the stock market tanks or it's just not doing as good as it used to, we tend to see consumers scale back their purchases in favor of saving, that, of course, causing negative demand shocks. The last of the determinants that we're interested in for right now is going to be the G, which stands for government policies. Now, we're not going to get into this in a lot of detail here because government policies get their own separate unit a little bit later on in the semester. All the students need to know at this point is that your government policies are basically fiscal policy and monetary policy, and that depending on what the government's doing with relation to fiscal and monetary policy, they can either drive up aggregate demand with positive shocks or drive down aggregate demand with negative shocks. I don't really want to go into what exactly those policies are because they get their own separate unit a little bit later on. But government policies do tell you what's going to happen to government spending overall. Now, you may have noticed we're not going to talk about what causes net export spending to change here, although net exports is also one of those determinants of aggregate demand. That's because in order to understand net exports and aggregate demand, students really need the foreign exchange market, which is the very last thing we're going to do this semester. So you may want to mention to them that we're not talking about what causes net exports to shift now, but they will know what that is by the end of the semester and by the time the AP exam rolls around. They're just not ready for that information at this exact point. Hopefully this is helpful for you. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me.